All right, guys, key concept 5.2, imperialism and nation state formation. So, this key concept is going to primarily focus on imperialism. That was chapter 24 and chapter 23. And also the idea of nationalism, right? New nations emerging like Germany and Italy. All right, key concept 5.21 states industrializing powers established transoceanic empires. Subconcept A states that states with existing colonies strengthen their control over those colonies. So you want to be able to identify examples of imperialism, right? So we know the English were colonizing India. They also had colonies in Africa, especially South Africa. We talked about, in chapter 24, the Belgium. Belgium had a colony in the Congo, right? That was King Leopold. The French were colonizing in Indochina, which today would be Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The Dutch were also in Africa and Indonesia, right? Malaysia. The Spanish had colonies in the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. Eventually, they would lose those colonies after the Spanish-American War. And I think this is an important statement, right? Building an empire was one way for a country to compete for power and assert its national identity in the global arena. So, not only did colonization help the economy, it also was a source of national pride. It helped unify a country. This idea of, we are a powerhouse because we have colonies. And that's, I think, an important piece to remember. Subconcept B states European states, as well as the Americans, the Japanese, established empires throughout Asia and the Pacific, while the Spanish and Portuguese influence declined. So you want to be able to identify examples of Japanese and American imperialism. So, for example, the Japanese fought the Chinese in the Sino-Japanese War. They defeated the Chinese and they gained the island of Taiwan. Eventually, the Chinese would kind of regain that island during the 20th century. Also, the Japanese went to war with the Russians in the Japanese-Russo War, and the war was not necessarily a victory, but the Treaty of Portsmouth gave Japan basically control of Korea. So they were, Japan again is imperializing in the Pacific. And again, I think Taiwan and Korea are two great examples of that. They also were able to gain a foothold in Manchuria, which is northern China. The U.S. annexed Hawaii after American planners overthrew Queen Liliuokalani. We studied that in U.S. History 1. And eventually, after the Spanish-American War, they annexed the Philippines, even though there was a Filipino rebellion led by Emilio Aguinaldo. Again, we studied him in U.S. History 1. So the U.S. again acquiring or pretty much seizing Hawaii and the Philippines. Those would be the two early. They weren't colonies because they became part of the United States, so those were more territories. All right. Subconcept C states many European states use both warfare and diplomacy to establish empires. So you want to be able to provide examples of conflict and diplomacy to to enable European nations to have these empires. And I think the best example of that would be King Leopold, his reign of terror in the Congo. He made a lot of money. This is also a great example of economic imperialism, $1 billion in profits from the ivory and rubber trade, extracting those resources. But the problem would be that he used a slave-like labor system. He was brutal to the workers. He would terrorize the workers by severing their hands. He would murder workers. He would call for the murder of workers who maybe were resisting, and he would work many of the local Congolese people to death. Overall, 3 to 8 million workers perished. So that may not be conflict, but I think it would be, kind of using, violence to submit or to oppress the African people. But a better example of warfare would be the Boer Wars and the Anglo-Zulu War. If you recall, the Boer Wars actually were wars between the British and Dutch natives. So prior to the British, the Dutch had colonized South Africa, and the Dutch who were born there, kind of like, Creoles, they were called Afrikaners. Eventually, they were driven off their lands by the British and placed into concentration camps. The Afrikaners teamed up with African peoples in that region. But again, it was really pretty much a loss for both the Afrikaners and Africans who were put into concentration camps. The black camps were much worse off. 15,000 African peoples died. But at the end, again, the Boer Wars allowed the British to control South Africa. And then the Anglo-Zulu War, that would be a war between the British and the local Zulu tribes on the southeastern coast of Africa. That would add to the British colony in South Africa. So again, two great examples of colonial wars that increased the British hold on at least South Africa. A great example of diplomacy would be the Berlin Conference. I wouldn't call it diplomacy in the sense that the African people didn't have much of a say. It's at that conference in Germany in 1884 where the European powers pretty much carve up Africa. This is where you see, this is a great example of that scramble for Africa. The peoples of Africa had no representation, so again, I really can't call it diplomacy, but it's probably the best example of that. I think an important piece to remember, the cultural effect of imperialism, is that by carving up Africa, the European powers also redrew borders. The problem with that is that it tore apart united societies or societies of people that had similar ethnic backgrounds, and that caused those societies to be combined with rival ethnic groups. We mentioned the problem in Rwanda, which really exploded after colonization, where two groups of ethnic Rwandans were kind of put together, and at the time under Belgian influence, there wasn't a lot of conflict because the Belgian government was in control. But once the Belgian government left, those two rival groups kind of went at it. So by the 20th century, this border realignment will eventually lead to civil war and a refugee crisis. And in the case of Rwanda, a genocide. So the Rwandan genocide is very important. Again, that's going to come up in the next unit, but it begins here with border realignment. All right, subconcept D states in some parts of their empires, Europeans established settler colonies. We talked about this in the last unit, right? Settler colonies were a great example. That would be the penal colonies. Australia was a prison colony. There were some settlers, farmers that went to Australia, but it was primarily a prison colony. That ends in 1850. Just mostly because Australia wasn't really much of a punishment. It's a beautiful place to live. Eventually, you're going to see gold miners go to Australia when gold's discovered in 1851. So, these were kind of forced settler colonies, and eventually these were, not forced settler colonies, or at least in the case of Australia. Subconcept E states in other parts of the world, industrialized states practice economic imperialism, right? So the idea of you're taking over a colony for economic reasons, right? England and the U.S., were investing heavily in Latin America. Teddy Roosevelt, basically helped the people of Panama declare independence against Colombia. And that opened the door to the building of the Panama Canal. So the U.S. helped kind of pretty much built that canal, subsidized that canal, and then reaped the profits, even though it was not in the United States. They ended up sending, I believe it was Roosevelt, also sent, actually it was Taft, one of our presidents during that time, seized the Dominican Republic with military assistance, mostly because we feared that the Dominican government owed so much to Europe in terms of debt that European countries like England would come calling. So we kind of seized this country temporarily. We helped pay off their debts, and we kind of governed them until eventually they were independent. But again, that's a great example of investing. We also, after the Spanish-American War, we helped build roads, schools, and hospitals in Cuba and Puerto Rico. Cuba was given their independence, but Puerto Rico remained a territory, and then eventually it became a commonwealth. King Leopold's Reign of Terror, a great example of economic imperialism in Belgium. His rule saw a billion in profits from the Congo, and we talked about the brutal working conditions for workers who were harvesting ivory and rubber. 8 million laborers perished, but again, it definitely benefited the Belgian people and King Leopold. All right, the Opium Wars, I think that's a great example of economic imperialism, right? We talked about the Chinese were resisting the opium trade. A war erupts between England and the Qing people, and it resulted in pretty much a loss for the Chinese, the Qing government, and it resulted in the Treaty of Nanking, which helped England because it opened up more ports in China. It gave them commercial privileges, trade rights, and also diplomatic privileges, right? Extraterritoriality rights, where they had they were kind of free from rule in a sense. They were, the people of China had kind of some privileges, legal privileges. Also, the Chinese were going to be more open to missionary work. And again, the European traders were going to have more, more of an ability to trade those goods. That's hence the sphere of influence, right? So remember, England never really controlled China with the exception of perhaps Hong Kong, but there was a lot of influence and economic intervention by the British and the French. All right, the Sino-French War of 1884, it's another great example of economic imperialism. This could also be, an example of conflict. The French go to war with the Chinese in 1884, and they gain control of northern Vietnam. Also, England seizes control of Egypt and the Suez Canal in 1882. Again, that canal was important for trade. So I think a common denominator would be England's using military force to reap the benefits of imperialization in Egypt and in China and India too. We failed to mention India. All right, key concept 5.22. Imperialism influenced state formation and contraction around the world. So this idea of new states are emerging, and some states are contracting. I think China is a good example of that, where imperial power is in decline because of imperialism. All right, so subconcept A states the expansion of the U.S. and European influence over Tokugawa Japan led to the emergence of the Meiji dynasty. So that's important, right? Notice the Meiji dynasty is mentioned in the core curriculum, so you have to understand the ins and outs of that dynasty. So basically, we go from an isolationist Japan during the Tokugawa reign to a more open and accepting reign during the Meiji dynasty, right? So we're going to see the increase of industry and westernization in Japan, but not colonial takeover. In fact, Japan was becoming an imperial power. They were able to resist imperialism, but they were opening their doors to, again, European and American influence. I think we always remember Matthew Perry. He's the American commander who was the first American to kind of enter into this, or political leader who enters into Japan. He kind of opens that door in 1853 and kind of begins the process of helping to westernize Japan. There's the Meiji Restoration. I'm still not sure how to pronounce that. Again, it follows the Tokugawa period. Remember, the shogunates were in control. The emperor was more of a figurehead. They were rejecting missionary work. You weren't allowed to build ships. And that's going to change, right? Where we're going to see the emperor emerge now as the ruling power. The shogunates are going to see diminished power. The samurais are going to see diminished power. And with the help of the United States, we're going to see railroads and roads being built. The government's going to pay for the training of new workers. They're going to create technical schools for workers and managers. How are they going to pay for this? They're going to tax farms, right? They're not giving up on agriculture, but they want to use the profits from agriculture to build up industry. And they're going to use U.S. Americans to advise and guide them in this, especially when it comes to the military. If you've ever seen The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise, American military experts are going to come in and help train the Japanese military, and that's going to really help them. Eventually, Japan's going to be a military power, and we're going to be fighting them in World War II. Also, there are changes to their legal system, more of a focus on equality before the law over punishment. A constitutional monarchy is going to emerge where the emperor is going to be checked by a constitution. And as I mentioned, the shogunate, or that military dictatorship, is going to fall apart, and the emperor is now the most powerful person in Japan. All right, subconcept B states the US, Japan, and Russia emulated European transoceanic imperialism by expanding their land borders and conquering neighboring territories. So you want to provide examples of imperialism by the US, Japan, and Russia. The Monroe Doctrine is a great example of this. In 1823, James Monroe tells Europe to stay out of the Americas, right? Our fear is that the Spanish and the British might try to reclaim old colonies. We want to keep the Caribbean region open to trade, slavery at the time, right? The sugar trade. And it's a statement, right? We don't really act on this, but it is kind of an early example of American interventionism in the Americas. The Spanish-American War, another great example of American imperialism. We defeat the Spanish in 1898. It's the end of Spain's colonial empire, at least in the Americas. Remember, this is after the Creole Revolution, so Spain was kind of barely holding on. Why did we go to war? We studied this in US 1. Remember, we were kind of sympathetic to the Cuban struggle for independence, but mostly, we believe that the sinking of the Maine was a main factor. But overall, it was probably a war that President McKinley wanted to fight, right? He wanted those territories. He wanted to control the Americas. So, as you know, he might have used the sinking of the Maine as an excuse. As a result, we've become a major military power. Our Navy becomes one of the strongest navies in the world. Following that, we build the canal to help our military and merchant ships following the war. It was difficult to get to Cuba from, say, the Pacific. We engage in a war with the Filipinos. We're not ready to give them independence, and Emilio Aguinaldo resists that, but he loses, and we end up annexing the Philippines in 1902. And the annexation of Hawaii in 1898. Some great examples of American imperialism. We were not the imperial power that the English were, or the French, or the Dutch, but we definitely had a lot of influence in the Americas, and in, at least in the case of Philippines in Asia. All right, Russia. Again, we haven't spent a lot of time on Russia, but Peter the Great expands Russian boundaries into Crimea. Siberia, which I think is easy to remember, it's that huge, eastern part of Russia where there's really not much out there. Stalin used Siberia for gulags and prison camps. Alaska, the Russians actually had some colonial outposts in Alaska, and Poland in Eastern Europe. He paid mercenary soldiers known as Cossacks, right, to kind of fight for him. The Crimean War was an attempt to access ports in the Black Sea. It was a terrible loss for the Russians, and that led to changes. The end of the peasant system, because Alexander felt that the peasants were not strong fighters. The economy was very weak. And he needed to kind of change the system. And that's going to lead to increased industrial growth. He's going to push for more factories. He's going to promote tariffs to expand factories. He's going to try to ignite the coal and iron industries as well. And following Alexander under Tsar Nicholas, we're going to see the building of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. So again, examples of pretty much by the end of Peter's reign, Russia has expanded, but to control this expansion, the Russians are going to build the railroad. The Japanese are expanding after the Sino-Japanese War and the Japanese-Russo War. After the Japanese-Russo War, which was again considered a draw, Teddy Roosevelt outlines a peace treaty that actually ends up giving Japan Korea and northern China, which is known as Manchuria. So that's a win-win for Japan. All right, subconcept C states anti-imperial resistance, that's the key word, resistance, took various forms, including direct resistance, which would be military resistance, within empires, and the creation of new states on the periphery. So the focus here would be on how the people of the colonies resisted. So I think this is non-violent resistance, not direct resistance. The Indian National Congress. It's India's first native political party. It's a nationalist movement in the British Empire, meaning the people are coming together to fight for independence. unite the people of India against colonial rule. The policy was known as Swadeshi, or of our own country. Not that that's that important, but understand the purpose of the National Congress would be to unite the people in this independence movement. And to fight the British, they encouraged the people of India to boycott British goods. Don't buy British salt or British textiles. Make your own. That's what Gandhi is seen doing in some pictures, encouraging the people to be self-sufficient, to hurt the economy of England. And it worked. Eventually, in the next unit, we're going to learn about India's eventual independence. Mohandas Gandhi, again, is a member of the Congress, and he will lead that nonviolent movement. He supported the idea of civil disobedience or passive resistance, disobeying unjust laws non-violently. Okay, so it's the Indian National Congress, and again, a member would be Gandhi, but we're going to learn more about him down the road. The Sepoy Mutiny in India is a great example of more direct resistance. The Sepoys were Indian soldiers who were working for the British. They were angry that the British were making them use guns that were greased with livestock fat. They believed that goes against Hindu beliefs. They believed that England was trying to convert them from Buddhism and Hinduism to more of a traditional Christian belief system, and they fight. It was also known as the Rebellion of 1857, but it was crushed by the English, but an example of direct resistance. The Opium Wars, great example of resistance by the Qing against the British trade, the growing trade power. It was a loss. The Boxer Rebellion, another great example. The Righteous and Harmonious Order of Fists, or Boxers, in 1899 begin to attack Westerners. They believed violent change would result in a golden age. They targeted Christian missionaries and converts. Remember, Christian missionaries were kind of criticizing ancestor veneration and some of the other traditions like foot binding. So that was a source of tension and resentment. Eventually, though, the government in southern China was sympathetic to westernization, so they helped protect foreigners and Christians especially. And then the U.S. and the British joined together to put down the rebellion. Again, another unsuccessful rebellion. The Boxer Rebellion, that's in China. The Xhosa cattle killing movement's another great example. The Xhosa people wanted to expel the British in this region of Africa, more southern Africa, in 1856. They were frustrated that British livestock was spreading disease, so they kill the cattle. They destroy crops to get spirits to destroy the British. A very, again, religious, spiritual belief system. But that only resulted in famine. It kind of backfired on them. So that's the Xhosa cattle killing movement. The Xhosa were a native group of people. And then this image depicts the Anglo-Zulu War. The Zulu people of Southeast Africa along the Indian Ocean also rebelled against the British. That too was a loss or a defeat for the local people. Notice the common denominator, right? Unsuccessful rebellions. All right, key concept 5.23. This is the final slide. Very important. Please understand this. To justify imperialism, the European powers use the idea of social Darwinism. And we've talked about this, Darwin's theory. Charles Darwin was a scientist who kind of explained that some animals, some species survive because they're fit. And it's okay if they die out. They didn't adapt, right? So this scientific theory is applied to social theory. And the idea is that the European powers were superior to native peoples, and therefore taking over is justified because the European powers are fitter. However, the European powers believed it was their duty to uplift, educate, as you can see the cartoon, one of my favorite political cartoons, educate, train, convert these weaker, inferior peoples. And if they didn't adapt, if they didn't conform and they disappeared, well then so be it, right? That again, whether it was, then therefore perhaps warfare was justified if they rebelled. Okay, so definitely remember this concept. Notice it is specifically referenced in the concepts. That means it'll be part of a primary source, or it could be a primary source. It could definitely be a multiple choice question. It could be a short essay. It could be, again, in many forms. I can't stress this concept enough. All right, that's it.